I did not expect to love Girls Frontline 2's story as much as I do. I mean that as directly as I can put it. I went in expecting a decent gacha story, the kind you enjoy well enough and move on from, and somewhere along the way that stopped being true. For a long time, I couldn't actually tell you why. Then I got to Downforger, bounty on the protagonist's head, a whole new settlement, tomatoes of all things, a city leader who turns out to be exactly as bad as city leaders always turn out to be in these stories. On paper, none of that explains it either, but something about how this chapter unfolded finally made the why click for me. And once it did, I realized that this episode isn't actually the reason I love this story. It's just the cleanest example I've run into of the thing that's been doing it to me all along. So that's what I actually want to talk about today. Not is Downforger good? What I want to get at is why Girls Frontline 2's storytelling keeps landing for me in a way most gacha stories don't. And I think it comes down to the same shift, showing up at 3 different scales once I finally laid it out side by side. Let's start with the shape of the story itself. Here's something I've noticed across a lot of gacha games, and I don't think it's actually a criticism. Most of them tell pretty straightforward stories. That's not the same as saying they lack complexity. Plenty of them have plenty of it. It's just that the complexity usually lives around the story, in the lore, the setting, the characters filling in the edges. The actual thread of the plot, the thing that's moving you from scene to scene, mostly stays put. You start on a road, the world around that road gets richer and stranger the further you go, but the road itself doesn't really change what it's doing. Watch what happens with our protagonist here. Freedom is the whole operating logic of who this character's been since the start. Mercenary work, containment zones, one contract into the next. Nobody tracks a mercenary long enough to matter. You finish the job, you're gone. The next city doesn't know your face yet. Then there's a bounty on their head, real weight behind it, corporate backing, the kind that doesn't expire when you change zones. On paper, that's a completely standard gacha bit. Bounty happens, there's the chase, it resolves, next chapter moves on like nothing changed. That's not what happens here. They can't move the way they used to, at all. So for the first time in this character story, they do something the plot has never once asked of them. They stop. They settle within a dull community led by Ulrid, not passing through, actually settling. And settling isn't the same as hiding. With a bounty like this, hiding alone doesn't hold forever. So using tech recovered from an old abandoned structure nearby, they figure out how to grow tomatoes, in a zone where food's been scarce this entire game. I keep coming back to how funny this is on the surface. A mercenary who used to measure success in completed contracts and clean exits is now measuring it in crop yield. That's not new lore stacked onto an unchanged plot, that's the plot's own dynamic changing shape, which is the actual distinction I think I've been missing this whole time. It's not that other gacha games don't get complex, it's that the complexity almost never touches the storytelling mechanism itself. The way the story is actually being told keeps following the same thread it started on, no matter how much detail piles up around it. Girls Frontline 2 is the first place I've seen the thread itself bend. But food alone doesn't sustain a community. You need buyers, so they go looking, and they find one. A genuinely prosperous city, wealthy enough to be trading with both the green zone and the white zone, which should be good news. A stable trade partner, exactly what a community trying to become self-sufficient needs. And then the story does the thing it always eventually does to you in this genre. The city's leader, George, turns out to be working with the exact same corporations that put the bounty on our protagonist in the first place. The same thing that took their freedom is exactly what's waiting at the end of the one path they had left. Most gacha roads widen as they go. This one curves back and bites the person walking it. Here's something I never really admitted out loud before this episode. Even when a gacha story delivers genuinely great storytelling, even when I'm fully immersed in it, some part of me never forgets I'm watching something fictional. I think I finally know why. It's the characters. Even the good ones in this genre tend to arrive at the right answer the first time they're tested. Clean choice, clean resolution. It's well executed, it's satisfying, but it's also structurally a little too neat to ever fully disappear into. Real people don't usually get it right on the first try. This episode is the first time in this genre a character's mistake made me forget for a second that I was watching a script. Take Groza. There's been a mystery sitting under her since basically the start of this game. Missing memories, something clearly wrong. A door the story kept open on purpose, ally who's secretly compromised. Antagonist in waiting, could have gone anywhere. Here, her memories come back, the show doesn't dwell on the specifics, that's not really the point, but what we get instead is behavior. She spirals when the protagonist gets captured, not exposition about trauma, just a person visibly not okay, in real time, because of something that happened to her a long time ago and never got resolved cleanly. A mystery that pays off as a character instead of a lore drop. But the one that actually pins this down best isn't even playable. Mei-Ling keeps the whole moving base running. This arc doesn't function without her, and she barely gets screen time most chapters. She's offered the option to leave, go back to her hometown, be safe. And here's the thing, the story never pretends she's going to take it. We already know she won't, from how she's written the whole game. But the protagonist doesn't get to know that with certainty, they just know Mei-Ling's life is more dangerous now, and they care about her enough to make sure the door is actually open. Not because they want her gone, because they don't want to be the reason she never had a choice. And Mei-Ling misreads it completely. Here's the offer and here's they want me to leave. Be honest with yourself for a second, would you have read it any differently? That's not a plot twist, that's just what happens when someone tries to be careful with another person's feeling, and it comes out sideways anyway. I don't think I've seen a gacha game sit inside that kind of ordinary miscommunication before, and I don't think I felt the character feel quite this unscripted before either. Even the two new dolls end up proving the same point, with less weight riding on it. Lorelei is a seductive spy archetype, doing exactly what you'd expect from that description. Animated sequence and all, infiltrating a party, dancing with the protagonist, which matters more than it sounds in a visual novel format game where animation is never the default. They spent it on her. The smaller moment is the one that got me though. She and the protagonist infiltrate the prison together, and she stays fully in her guard persona even alone with them. Past the point it's strategically necessary. Professionalism, or is she just having a little too much fun when nobody's watching? The story doesn't tell us. I like that it doesn't. Though, from what another prisoner apparently mentioned afterward, the guard and prisoner act they kept for those few days sounded like it got surprisingly committed. Make of that what you will, given who we're talking about. But between the two of them, the one that actually got me wasn't Lorelei, it was Cheyenne. I don't usually go looking for myself in fictional characters. I'm a pretty weird person, it doesn't happen easily. But it happened here. She fights alone against a Gen 3 doll, convinced she's unremarkable. Then, right after proving exactly how capable she is, she asks the protagonist to let her stay by their side, and nearly breaks down doing it. Because she still doesn't believe her own competence counts for anything. And I want to be honest about which half of that I actually saw myself in. It wasn't the part where she solos a Gen 3 doll and walks away fine. I don't exactly have a Gen 3 doll to solo in my day-to-day. It was the other half, proving something to yourself and still not believing it counts. Capable and insecure at the same time, not in sequence, harder to write than it sounds. The story doesn't move forward cleanly, and the people in it don't resolve cleanly either. Both keep folding back on themselves instead of just walking on. And that, I think, is the actual reason this is the first gacha story where I've stopped feeling the seams. Which brings me to the one part of this chapter I didn't expect to have feelings about, the villain. Full transparency, this one's not as obvious as the last two, but I think it's there, and I think it's the same shift, just quieter. I have to be honest about something though, and it's a little embarrassing. George might be the antagonist I've personally disliked the most in this entire game, not because he's badly written, he's very well written, that's the actual problem. There's nothing supernatural about him, no grand ideology dressed up as tragedy. He's someone who, at some point, ended up with nothing and decided the only person he could ever fully trust was himself. From there, everything else becomes negotiable if it gets him closer to his goal, including people, treated less like people and more like resources with a shell life. Clinically, it's just sociopathy wearing a good suit. What actually got under my skin wasn't the ideology, it was the delivery. The crafted smile that never quite reaches anywhere real, the tone that's just slightly too smooth, too rehearsed, that fake warm, almost political cadence, like every sentence got pre-approved by someone whose job is optics. I have a genuinely bad reaction to that in real people. Couldn't fully explain why. Something about that specific register just runs straight down my spine. And credit where it's due, however, reluctantly. The Japanese voice direction nailed it completely. I hate how accurate it is. Now, here's the part I think most people would skip past, and I almost did too. It's not just that George is a good villain, it's how this conflict actually got here in the first place. Most gacha games build their episodic conflicts as extensions of the main plot. The antagonist of the arc exists because the central conflict needed a local phase for it this chapter. Even the character arcs wrapped around that antagonist are tethered to the bigger story from the moment they show up. That's not a flaw, it's just how the genre usually structures things. This conflict didn't start that way. We're the mercenary, we needed a buyer for the tomatoes. That's it. That's genuinely as small and disconnected from any bigger plot as a reason to visit a city gets. It's only after we're already committed to that trade relationship that things spiral. George turns out to be tied to the exact same corporations that put the bounty on us to begin with. The conflict didn't arrive pre-wired into the plot, it found its way in after we were already standing in the middle of it. Most gacha stories start from the conflict and dress it in local flavor. This one started from something as mundane as needing someone to buy vegetable from, and let the conflict came find us. The city didn't start as George's alone either. He had a friend who helped build it with him, back when, presumably, they both wanted the same thing for it. Somewhere along the way, that stopped being true. One of them became the man now trading with the corporations that put a bounty on our protagonist. The other one is still in that city, still believing in whatever version of it they originally set out to build. His friend matters here too, and not just as the side character on the right side of things. He's proof that George's whole worldview was a choice, not an inevitability. Same starting point, same city. Where George decided the only answer was trusting no one, his friend decided something else. So the fight was never really against the city, it's about who gets to lead it, which is why we end up helping unseat George and put someone who actually deserves it in his place. And that's where this chapter closes its loop in a way I genuinely didn't expect going in. Mostly because with all the things going on, I kind of forgot. But remember why we came here. Tomatoes, a trade partner, something almost embarrassingly small next to bounties and corporate conspiracies, and a man who talks like a press release. With George gone and his friend now leading the city, trade actually opens up. Which means, after all of that, the bounty, the settlement, the mystery, the villain, the whole detour, our protagonist walks away having accomplished exactly the modest thing they set out to do at the start. They found a buyer. Somewhere in the wreckage of dethroning a sociopath backed by a shadow corporation, our mercenary turned farmer quietly became the tomato king of the wasteland. I'm not even being sarcastic, that's genuinely how the chapter closes, and I think that's kind of perfect. So back to where I actually started. Why did I end up loving the story so much more than I expected to? Because the same shift happens at 3 different scales, and I didn't notice it until I laid this chapter out side by side with everything else. The plot itself stops following one straight thread. The characters stop landing on the right answer the first time. Even a conflict stops arriving pre-built. It grows out of something as small as needing a buyer for tomatoes. Most gacha games build their complexity into the lore and keep the actual storytelling simple. Girls Frontline 2 does the opposite, and Downforger isn't special because it does this once. It's just the clearest single place I've caught the game doing what it's apparently been doing for a while. I think that's the thing I have been responding to this whole game. I just didn't have the words for it until this chapter forced me to find them. So tell me, which part hit you hardest? Mailing's misread? Cheyenne almost breaking after winning? Or George's whole unbearably polished thing? And has any other gacha story pulled off this kind of structural curveball for you? Anyway, that's gonna be all from me for this one. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe if you want to see more story discussions like this one. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.